The sun had barely begun its slow ascent over the quiet suburban streets when Ethan Walker settled into his usual seat at the small cafe on Hawthorne Avenue. The place was nothing special, just a simple coffee shop with outdoor seating, a favorite for locals who preferred fresh air with their morning brew. Ethan exhaled, letting the warmth of his black coffee seep into his fingers. Beside him, lying obediently by his chair, was Max, a golden retriever with a thick coat and eyes that spoke of experience beyond an ordinary pet's. Max wasn't just a dog. He was a combat-trained veteran, a survivor of war just like Ethan. The retriever's ears twitched slightly at the sound of passing footsteps, his muscles tensing before relaxing again. Always aware. Always ready. Ethan took another sip of coffee, adjusting his prosthetic leg under the table. His right arm, a sleek, high-tech prosthetic, rested comfortably on his lap. Some people stared when they noticed the artificial limbs. Others avoided looking at all. Ethan was used to both reactions. He had served his country, lost parts of himself in the process, and come home to a world that moved on without him. Only Max remained constant. This was their routine, coffee in the morning, a quiet moment before the world woke up. But today, the peace wouldn't last. The stillness of the morning was shattered by the distinct growl of high-end sports car engines. Ethan instinctively tensed, even though he wasn't in a war zone anymore. Old habits died hard. 2 luxury cars, a sleek black Maserati and a white Porsche, pulled into the parking lot. The doors swung open, and 4 men in their mid-20s emerged, their designer sunglasses shielding their privileged, self-satisfied expressions. Ethan had seen their kind before, entitled, rich, invincible in their own minds. The type that had never fought for anything a day in their lives. The leader of the group, a tall, muscular guy with perfectly styled hair, smirked as he took in the cafe. Brandon Carter. Ethan had seen him around, local trust fund brat, always making noise, always getting away with it. His friends trailed behind him, Jason, Matt, and Connor, all cut from the same expensive cloth. Perfect teeth, expensive cologne, and an arrogance that filled the air like smoke. Brandon stretched, cracking his neck as he scanned the tables. Then, his eyes landed on Ethan and Max. The smirk widened. Well, he said loudly. Look at this badass right here. Ethan ignored him. What's up, Rambo? Brandon continued, stepping closer. You lose a fight with a landmine? Jason chuckled. Matt hesitated, glancing at the retriever lying at Ethan's feet. Yo, that's a big dog, he muttered. Brandon, undeterred, whistled. Damn, never seen a war vet with a service dog? Bet this one's seen some shit. Ethan set his cup down, locking eyes with Brandon through the dark lenses of his sunglasses. Move along, he said flatly. But Brandon wasn't the kind of guy who took orders. Relax, man, Brandon said, raising his hands in mock surrender. We're just making conversation. No need to get all serious. Max, who had been still the entire time, suddenly lifted his head. His golden coat bristled slightly, his ears perked up, and his eyes locked onto Brandon. A silent warning. Brandon noticed. His smirk twisted into something more amused, more dangerous. Oh, I get it, he said, glancing at his friends. Tough guy doesn't need to talk. His little mutt does all the work for him. Connor snickered. Yo, what's with the dog? Ain't he supposed to help you walk or something? Ethan's jaw tightened. He could ignore the insults, the childish taunts, but Max? That was a line no one crossed. Brandon leaned down slightly, tilting his head at Max. What's your name? Huh? Killer? Sergeant Fluff. He laughed at his own joke before making a quick movement toward Max's face, like he was about to grab him. Max didn't move. He didn't bark, didn't flinch. He just stared, unblinking, calculating. Ethan knew that stance well. The dog was assessing threats. Brandon straightened, clicking his tongue. Damn, I was expecting a little more action. Thought war dogs were supposed to be badass. Step back, Ethan said, his voice low and firm. Brandon turned back to him, the smirk faltering for just a second. Then, as if realizing people were watching, he forced out a laugh. Relax, Gramps. Just having some fun. But he wasn't done. Brandon's eyes flicked back to Max, and this time, his expression darkened. Bet he only listens to you, huh? He took a step closer. Max stood. The movement was smooth, practiced, controlled, not an attack, but a silent warning. The golden retriever's tail stiffened, his posture shifting from relaxed to guard-ready. Brandon hesitated. Just for a second. Jason whispered, Yo, dude, maybe chill. But Brandon didn't chill. Instead, he did something incredibly stupid. He nudged Ethan's chair with his knee, making it rock slightly. just enough to push against Ethan's prosthetic leg. The moment was over in an instant. Max moved. He didn't lunge. He didn't bite. But his bark was deafening, a deep, powerful command that shook the entire patio. Brandon stumbled back, visibly startled. A few cafe patrons turned their heads. Someone even raised their phone, beginning to record. "Jesus," Brandon muttered, his heart racing. He looked around, then forced a laugh. "Damn, you see that? Almost pissed myself." Connor and Jason laughed along, but there was tension now. Max hadn't moved. He stood tall, his chest rising and falling slowly, his body a wall between Ethan and the man who didn't understand what he was playing with. Ethan finally spoke, his voice steady. "You should leave." Brandon met his gaze. For a long second, something passed between them, something unspoken. Then, slowly, Brandon smirked again. "Yeah, all right," he said, stepping back. "Let's bounce." He turned on his heel, motioning for his friends to follow. But as he walked away, he muttered just loud enough for Ethan to hear. "It's just a dog." Max didn't take his eyes off Brandon's retreating form. His body was still tense, still waiting. Ethan reached down, running his hand along Max's head. "Easy, buddy," he whispered. "We're not done yet." Because Ethan had seen that look before. And he knew, without a doubt, this wasn't over. The low hum of sports car engines faded into the distance, but the tension they left behind still clung to the air like smoke. Ethan took a slow breath, his fingers brushing through Max's thick fur. His golden retriever was still standing, his muscles tense, his gaze locked on the street where Brandon and his friends had disappeared. Ethan knew that look. A soldier waiting for the next move. And Ethan had learned a long time ago, trust your dog. The cafe's usual morning chatter had returned, but now with murmurs of speculation. A few people still glanced Ethan's way, some curious, some concerned. He could feel the weight of their stares, the silent question hanging in the air. Is there going to be trouble? A woman in her early 40s, petite, dark hair pulled into a tight ponytail, stepped closer to his table. Ethan recognized her from past visits. Sophia, the cafe owner. "You okay?" she asked quietly. Ethan gave a slight nod. "Yeah." Sophia frowned, glancing down at Max, who was still on edge. "That kid, Brandon, he's trouble. His dad owns half the businesses around here. Cops don't touch him." Ethan let out a quiet chuckle. "Figures." Sophia hesitated. "Look, I don't know if you want advice, but," she lowered her voice, "if I were you, I'd steer clear of him." Ethan tapped his fingers against the side of his coffee cup, considering her words. Steer clear. Once, maybe, that's what he would have done. Before the war. Before Max. Before he learned the hard way that bullies only stop when someone makes them. Ethan wasn't looking for a fight, but he sure as hell wasn't running from one. Max let out a low whine, his head snapping toward the street again. Ethan followed his gaze, and there it was. The black Maserati, parked at the corner of the street. From this distance, Ethan couldn't see inside, but he didn't need to. He could feel the eyes on him. They hadn't left. They were watching. Sophia noticed too. She muttered a curse under her breath. "Damn it. I knew that punk wouldn't let it go." Ethan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. He wasn't surprised, but he had been hoping, for just a second, that maybe this wouldn't turn into something bigger. He should have known better. Max was already watching the car, his ears flicking slightly as his sharp mind processed the situation. Ethan leaned down, speaking softly. "We good?" Max's tail didn't move. "Yeah." They weren't done yet. Ethan took his time finishing his coffee. If they were waiting for him to react, to look nervous, to leave in a hurry, they'd be disappointed. When he finally stood, adjusting his prosthetic leg, he moved slowly, deliberately. Max fell in step beside him, his body positioned just slightly ahead, a natural protective stance. The walk back home wasn't long, just a few blocks. Ethan kept his movements loose, casual, but his mind was already calculating exits, potential ambush spots, threats. Years of training never really left you. Behind him, the car's engine growled to life. "Here we go." They followed him, not too close, but not trying to hide it either. Ethan kept walking. If they wanted to make a move, they'd have to do better than that. The street ahead was mostly empty, save for an old man walking his terrier. Storefronts lined one side, the other had a narrow alleyway, a perfect spot for a setup. And sure enough, the white Porsche appeared from the opposite direction, blocking the sidewalk ahead. Ethan stopped. Max did too. The two cars idled, engines purring. Then, Brandon stepped out of the Maserati. His smirk was back, but this time, his eyes weren't amused, they were colder. "Hey, man," he called out. "What's the rush?" Ethan didn't answer. Jason and Connor climbed out of the Porsche, while Matt leaned against the hood, arms crossed. The three of them spread out just enough to box Ethan in. Max let out a quiet growl, his body stiff. Brandon tilted his head. "Damn, that dog really doesn't like me, huh?" Ethan's voice was calm. Deadly calm. "Smart dog." Brandon let out a small laugh. "You know, you embarrassed me back there." Ethan remained silent. Brandon took a slow step forward. Max's growl deepened. "You think it's funny? A crippled old vet playing tough?" His lips curled. "You think your robot limbs and your overgrown pet make you some kind of badass?" Ethan's fingers twitched at his side. Brandon leaned in slightly. "You should have just laughed it off, man." And then he kicked Max. It wasn't a hard kick, not yet. More of a sharp, testing nudge to the dog's ribs. But it was enough. Max jerked back, his breath hitching in surprise. Then, silence. And in that silence, something shifted. Ethan's vision narrowed. His heart, which had remained steady the entire time, now pounded with quiet fury. Brandon chuckled, taking another small step. "What? He's not going to do anything? Maybe he's just a washed-up mutt like his owner." He didn't finish that sentence. Because Ethan moved. It was fast. Faster than Brandon expected from a man with prosthetics. Ethan's metallic hand shot out, grabbing Brandon by the collar. The entitled grin on Brandon's face vanished in an instant as he was yanked forward, nose to nose with Ethan. And what he saw in Ethan's eyes made him freeze. Pure, controlled rage. The kind of rage that belonged to a man who had seen death up close and survived it. Ethan's voice was quiet, but it cut through the night like a blade. "If you ever," he said, his grip tightening, "touch my dog again, you won't walk away." Brandon's breath hitched. His bravado cracked for just a second. Then, Max barked. A sharp, deafening warning. Brandon flinched. Behind him, his friends were tense, waiting, unsure if they should step in. Ethan released him, shoved him back. Brandon stumbled but caught himself, his face twisting in humiliation. He looked around, realizing people were watching, phones out, recording everything. A vein in his forehead pulsed. He hated losing control. Jason muttered, "Dude, let's go." But Brandon wasn't done. His face darkened. "You think this is over?" he spat. Ethan didn't blink. "It is for you." Brandon exhaled sharply, glaring at Ethan, then at Max. His fist clenched, his ego bruised beyond repair. Finally, he turned on his heel, storming back to his car. The others hesitated before following. Ethan didn't watch them leave. He only watched Max, who had stopped growling but remained rigid, still staring in their direction. Ethan rested a hand on the retriever's head. Max's muscles were still tight. Because, just like Ethan, he knew this wasn't over. The streets had gone quiet. Ethan stood there for a moment, breathing slow and deep, his metallic fingers flexing as the adrenaline still pulsed through his system. Max sat beside him, ears alert, tail stiff, watching, waiting. The Maserati and Porsche had disappeared into the night, but the tension remained. Ethan knew that look on Brandon's face before he left. It wasn't just anger. It was a promise. This wasn't over. Ethan adjusted his prosthetic leg, feeling the weight of it in every step as he and Max made their way back toward his apartment. It was a small, second-floor unit in a quiet building, nothing fancy. Just enough space for him and Max. As he reached his door, Max paused. His head lifted slightly, nose twitching. Ethan had learned to trust that reaction. His hand instinctively hovered near the knife strapped to his belt. Max let out a low woof, not a growl, but a sound of caution. Ethan scanned the hallway, his military instincts kicking in. No movement. No immediate threats. But that didn't mean nothing was there. Inside, Ethan murmured, unlocking the door. Max hesitated, just for a second, before stepping in. Ethan followed, locking the door behind them. Max went through his usual routine, sniffing the apartment, checking every corner. It was something he had done since the war. Some habits never died. Ethan tossed his keys onto the kitchen counter, rolling his prosthetic shoulder to ease the stiffness. But then, Max stopped. His head snapped toward the front door. Ethan felt it too. Something was off. He turned, staring at the door. It looked the same. But when he stepped closer, he noticed the doorknob was slightly smudged. And the bottom of the doorframe? There was the faintest scratch fresh. Someone had been here. Max let out a quiet growl. Ethan didn't move, didn't panic. Instead, he took a slow step back, letting his mind work. Brandon, or at least one of his idiot friends. They hadn't broken in. They were testing, seeing if they could rattle him. They were playing a game. Ethan had played much worse. Ethan sat on his couch, staring at the door, his mind calculating. Max lay at his feet, still alert. Then, his phone vibrated. He pulled it from his pocket, glancing at the screen. Unknown number. Ethan let it ring. It stopped, then started again. He sighed and answered, but didn't speak. A beat of silence. Then Brandon's voice. "You think you're tough, old man?" Ethan said nothing. Brandon chuckled, but there was an edge to it now. The kind that belonged to someone who was losing control and knew it. "You embarrassed me today," Brandon continued. "Made me look weak. I don't let that slide." Ethan still didn't speak. Another silence. Then Brandon's voice dropped lower. "I'm going to show you what it feels like to lose something important." Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. Max's ears twitched. Brandon let the words hang before the call cut off. Ethan stared at the phone for a long moment. Then he reached down and rested his hand on Max's back. They weren't coming for him. They were coming for Max. Ethan sat awake in the dim light of his apartment, his combat knife resting on the table. Max lay at his feet, still and quiet, but Ethan could feel his energy tense, prepared. They had been through this before. The waiting, the watching. Ethan wasn't naive. Brandon wasn't smart enough to do this alone. He had money, he had people, but he didn't have training. And that was his first mistake. It was almost 2 a.m. when Max lifted his head. His ears perked. His tail went stiff. Ethan felt his own heartbeat slow, his body instantly shifting into awareness. Then, a sound outside. Not loud. Deliberate. Someone was moving through the alley behind the building. Ethan didn't stand immediately. Instead, he listened. Footsteps. 2 sets. A quiet clicking sound, metal against metal. A lockpick. Idiots. Ethan's fingers wrapped around the handle of his combat knife. Max's muscles tensed. Then, the back door handle rattled. Max let out a growl, low and deep. The rattling stopped. A murmur from outside. Then more silence. Ethan could almost hear the hesitation. Then, a hard knock at the front door. Ethan didn't move. Max was locked on the door, unmoving. Another knock. Then a voice. "Hey, hero. You awake?" "Jason." Ethan exhaled slowly. He wasn't just dealing with Brandon anymore. Now, his friends were in it too. Another knock. Louder this time. Ethan remained still. Then, his phone buzzed. A text. "Unknown number. Come outside. Let's settle this." Ethan let out a slow breath. Max let out a quiet whine, shifting his weight slightly. Ethan reached down, running his fingers through the retriever's fur. "You ready, buddy?" he whispered. Max's body was still rigid, prepared. Yeah, they were ready. But Brandon and his friends? They had no idea what was coming. The air inside the apartment was still. Too still. Ethan could feel the weight of the moment pressing down, his instincts whispering the same thing they had whispered to him in combat zones. They're here. They think they have the upper hand. Max didn't move. But Ethan could feel his retriever's heartbeat through his palm, steady, but ready. Outside, the knocks had stopped. Now came the waiting. Ethan glanced at his phone again. Unknown number. Come outside. Let's settle this. A second text followed. Unknown number, or we come in. Max let out a low growl. Ethan exhaled slowly, eyes narrowing. All right, then. Let's play. The men outside weren't professionals. They were entitled punks with more money than brains. Ethan could tell from the way they moved, too loud, too confident, too reckless. They think this is a game. He had seen real threats before. The kind of men who knew how to kill silently, quickly. These weren't those men. Still, they were dangerous, not because of skill, but because of arrogance. And arrogance gets people killed. Ethan stood from the couch, his movements calm, practiced. Max mirrored him, his body low, muscles coiled. Ethan moved to the light switch. With a quiet click, the apartment went dark. The lock rattled again. The back door, not the front. Amateurs. They were trying to be sneaky now, as if that would help. A faint metallic sound, someone picking the lock. Max's ears flicked forward. Waiting. Ethan moved to the kitchen, stepping without a sound, his prosthetic foot barely making a noise against the floor. Through the dim moonlight, he could see the outline of the back door handle shifting. Then, click. The lock gave way. They were in. Ethan didn't move. Max didn't move. They waited. The door eased open. A dark figure stepped inside. Then another. Their silhouettes were backlit by the streetlights outside, giving Ethan a clear view of Jason and Matt. Jason whispered, "He's asleep. Let's move." Matt hesitated. "I don't know, man." Jason pushed forward. Big mistake. Because Max moved. The retriever was on Jason in a blink. Max didn't bark, didn't need to. Instead, he lunged, knocking Jason off balance, sending him crashing into the kitchen table. Jason yelped, arms flailing as Max's teeth clamped down onto his jacket sleeve. What the? Ethan was already moving. Before Matt could react, Ethan grabbed him by the back of the hoodie and yanked hard. Matt stumbled backward, slamming into the fridge. His eyes went wide as Ethan pressed his prosthetic arm against his throat, pinning him effortlessly. Jason was still struggling with Max, but the dog wasn't letting go. Ethan leaned in close to Matt, his voice calm, steady. You just broke into a soldier's house. Matt froze. Ethan tightened his grip. Let me tell you what happens next. Jason kicked wildly, trying to free himself from Max's grip. Call him off, man. Call him off. Ethan didn't. Instead, he turned his attention back to Matt. You're gonna tell me who sent you. Matt swallowed hard. We just wanted to scare you, man. Brandon. He just wanted to mess with you. We weren't gonna do anything serious, I swear, eh? Ethan pressed harder. Bullshit. Matt coughed, his eyes darting toward the front door. And that's when Ethan knew. More coming. The sound of footsteps outside made Ethan glance toward the front window. A third figure moved toward the door. Brandon. Ethan released Matt, shoving him toward the floor. Stay down, he ordered. Max finally let go of Jason, who scrambled backward, panting hard. Ethan motioned to Max's front door. The dog moved instantly, positioning himself just to the side of the entrance, waiting. The doorknob twisted. Ethan stayed where he was. Brandon pushed the door open just a crack. Then, Max barked. Loud, deep, terrifying. The kind of bark that shakes your bones. Brandon jumped back, cursing loudly. Then, the sound of tires screeching. Ethan smirked. There goes Connor. Brandon panicked. He wasn't expecting this. He thought Ethan was some broken-down old vet. He thought Max was just a dog. But now, he saw the truth. And he ran. The white Porsche peeled away, tires screaming against the pavement. Jason and Matt stumbled after him, breathless. Ethan didn't chase them. He didn't have to. Because this wasn't over. The apartment was silent again. Ethan stood near the door, Max still at his side, golden fur bristling. Slowly, Ethan reached down, running a hand along the retriever's back. Good job, buddy. Max exhaled slowly, finally relaxing. Ethan looked toward the window, watching the taillights of the Porsche disappear down the street. Then, his phone vibrated. A text. Unknown number. You're gonna regret that. Ethan smirked. Then he typed 2 words back. Come try. The text still lingered on Ethan's screen, glowing in the dimly lit apartment. You're gonna regret that. Max sat beside him, his chest rising and falling steadily, but Ethan could tell the dog was still on edge. So am I, buddy. Ethan's fingers hovered over the screen for a moment. He could have ignored it. Could have blocked the number. But he didn't. Instead, he typed 2 words. Come try. Then, he turned off his phone and waited. Because Brandon? Brandon wasn't done. Ethan barely slept. He didn't need to. He had spent years operating on exhaustion, training his body to survive on instinct alone. Max, however, didn't sleep at all. He stayed near the door, his golden fur bristling at every distant noise. Morning came, and with it, an eerie quiet. Too quiet. Ethan leashed Max and stepped outside, scanning the street as he moved toward the cafe. Everything looked normal. Except it wasn't. Sophia was already behind the counter when Ethan walked in. Her eyes flicked toward him, her expression tight. She knew. Something happened last night, she said. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Sophia pulled out her phone and turned the screen toward him. A video. Ethan pressed play. It was grainy, shaky phone footage, but there was no mistaking what it showed. Brandon, standing outside Ethan's building, around 2 a.m., pacing like a caged animal. The person filming had been across the street, hidden behind a parked car. The footage wasn't clear, but the rage on Brandon's face was unmistakable. Ethan's jaw tightened. What happened after this? He asked. Sophia hesitated. He left. But, Ethan. She leaned in slightly. He said something. To the camera. Ethan turned up the volume. The video continued. Brandon stopped pacing, turned, and faced the street. His voice was calm, too calm. He thinks this is over? I'll show him what real loss looks like. The screen went black. Max let out a low growl. Ethan clenched his prosthetic fist. Ethan didn't rush home. He didn't panic. That's what Brandon wanted. Instead, he walked. Max stayed close, tail stiff, scanning everything. When they turned onto Ethan's block, he saw it immediately. His truck. Or what used to be his truck. The windows had been smashed. The tires slashed. And across the side, in huge red spray paint, were the words, "Should have stayed down." Max's ears flattened. Ethan didn't move. Neighbors peered out from their windows. A few even stepped outside, murmuring amongst themselves. But Ethan? He just stood there. "This is your play, Brandon? Vandalism?" Ethan exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. Then he laughed. A dry, humorless chuckle. And that laughter? That's when Max relaxed. Because he knew. Ethan wasn't mad. Ethan was done playing. Ethan didn't bother calling the cops. It would be useless. Brandon's father had deep pockets, and money had a way of making problems disappear. No, Ethan didn't need cops. He needed time. And that's when he got an idea. He turned to Max, giving the dog a small, knowing smirk. "Looks like we're going hunting, buddy." Max's tail flicked once. Ethan didn't retaliate right away. That's what Brandon expected. Instead, he waited. He cleaned up the truck but didn't repaint the message. Let Brandon think he had one. Let him think Ethan was scared. Then, he made a few calls. Old contacts. People who owed him favors. By nightfall, he had everything he needed. And the next time Brandon came sniffing around, he wouldn't see it coming. It happened faster than expected. Ethan had just finished setting up when Max tensed. A car rolled up slowly, headlights dimmed. A Maserati. Max let out a quiet growl. Ethan didn't move. He just watched. Then Brandon stepped out. Alone. No backup this time. Just him. He stopped a few feet away, stuffing his hands into his jacket pocket. "Figured you'd be waiting." Ethan crossed his arms. "Figured you'd be stupid enough to come." Brandon smirked. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" Ethan exhaled, shaking his head. "You don't know what a real fight looks like," he said. Brandon's smirk faltered. Ethan took a slow step forward. Max mirrored him. "You think breaking a man's truck makes you dangerous?" Ethan continued, his voice low, controlled. Brandon stiffened. Ethan took another step. "You think calling me crippled makes you powerful?" Brandon swallowed hard. Then, Ethan smiled. A slow, cold smile. Brandon stepped back. Because for the first time, he saw it. The truth. Ethan wasn't scared. He was hunting. And Brandon? Brandon had just realized he was the prey. Brandon took another step back, but it was too late. Ethan had already read him. The cocky rich kid, so used to control, wasn't in control anymore. Max took a single step forward, muscles tight, ready. Brandon noticed. For the first time, Ethan saw something flicker across his face. Doubt. He had pushed too far. And now? There was no backing out. Brandon exhaled sharply, regaining some of his false bravado. "You think you've won?" His voice was tight. "You don't get it, do you?" Ethan tilted his head, calm as ever. "What exactly am I supposed to be getting?" Brandon grinned, but it was forced now. "You're not the only one with connections." Ethan remained still. Max didn't so much as twitch. Then, Brandon leaned in slightly. "My father owns this town," he whispered. "You really think I can't make your life hell?" Ethan finally smiled. "Go ahead and try." Brandon's expression cracked. And that's when he knew. He had lost. Brandon left. But Ethan knew that wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The next night, the harassment escalated. A brick through Ethan's window. His apartment door spray-painted with threats. Late-night phone calls, voices whispering threats before hanging up. Max remained on high alert, pacing near the door, ears perked at every sound. Ethan didn't sleep much. He was waiting. And finally, they came. It was 2:14 a.m. when Max growled. Ethan had been resting with his prosthetic leg off, but at the sound, he immediately snapped awake. Then, the door handle rattled. Max's body went rigid. Ethan grabbed his knife. Then, a whisper from outside. "Quiet. Don't wake him up." Ethan exhaled slowly, flexing his metal fingers. "They actually think this is gonna work." The lock picked. The door eased open. Max didn't move. Neither did Ethan. They waited. One step inside. Then two. Then, Ethan struck. Before the first intruder could react, Ethan moved fast, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him against the wall. Max lunged at the second one, teeth clamping down on his arm. A scream. Ethan kept his voice low, calm. "You broke into the wrong house." Jason. It was Jason. Pale, sweating, scared. Matt was the one struggling against Max, his voice high-pitched with panic. Ethan tightened his grip. Jason choked. "You want to play gangster?" Ethan growled. Then let's see if you can handle it. Matt screamed, flailing against Max's grip. Then, a third shadow in the doorway. Brandon. Brandon froze. He hadn't expected this. He thought Ethan would be afraid, that he'd beg for them to leave him alone. But instead, Jason was turning red from Ethan's grip. Matt was on the floor, pinned by a war-trained dog. And Ethan? Ethan was calm. Brandon finally understood. Ethan wasn't just some broken veteran. He was a soldier. And he was done playing. Ethan let Jason go, just enough for him to gasp for air. Brandon swallowed. Ethan met his eyes. Walk away, Brandon. Brandon hesitated. Jason coughed, wheezing. Matt whimpered beneath Max. Then, Brandon turned and ran. Jason stumbled after him. Matt, still bleeding, finally managed to crawl away, Max growling as he let him go. The three of them disappeared into the night. Ethan exhaled. Max stayed tense. Ethan knelt beside the retriever, running a hand through his fur. You did good, buddy. Max exhaled, his tail flicking once. Ethan stood. And he knew. This wasn't over. But next time, Brandon wouldn't walk away. The bruises would fade. The cuts would heal. But Brandon's ego? That was shattered beyond repair. Ethan knew it the second Brandon ran that night. Cowards never let things go. And when cowards had money and power, they got desperate. And desperation made people stupid. The morning after the break-in, Ethan sat on his couch, running his fingers absently through Max's fur. The dog had barely left his side. Even now, his ears twitched at every sound, his eyes constantly flicking toward the door. Max knew it wasn't over. Neither did Ethan. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. Ethan let it ring. Then came the text. Unknown number. Should have stayed down. Now we finish this. Max let out a low growl, sensing Ethan's shift in tension. Ethan exhaled. This was it. Brandon had one last play. And Ethan was going to let him make it. Brandon didn't come himself. He wasn't that kind of man. Instead, he sent others. Hired muscle. Professionals, this time. Ethan spotted them instantly. They weren't like Jason and Matt. They weren't loud, arrogant kids with something to prove. These men? They moved differently. Two men in a black SUV parked across from his apartment. Not looking at him, but watching. A third, sitting outside the cafe, pretending to drink coffee while his eyes flicked toward Ethan's building every few seconds. Ethan almost smiled. Finally, a real challenge. Ethan leashed Max and stepped outside. Didn't rush. Didn't hesitate. The moment he left the building, the men in the SUV took notice. The guy at the cafe sat up straighter. Waiting. Ethan pretended not to see them. But Max? Max's ears were up. His posture alert. He knew. They're coming. Ethan led them exactly where he wanted. Through the side streets. Away from his building. Away from cameras. A quiet stretch of road. Just them. And when Ethan stopped walking, they made their move. The SUV pulled up fast. Two men got out. One was huge, the kind of guy whose entire body looked like a weapon. The other was leaner, meaner. Scar across his jaw. Eyes sharp. Professional. Not punks. Not like Brandon. The cafe guy? Yeah. He was behind Ethan now. 3 against 1. They thought they had the advantage. They didn't. Ethan loosened Max's leash. Stay close, he murmured. The big guy cracked his knuckles. You made the wrong enemy, old man. Ethan smiled. Finally. Someone who wasn't talking about his leg. Big guy moved first. A wide punch, meant to break bones. Ethan stepped in, too close for the swing to land. Used his prosthetic arm to slam into the guy's ribs. The man grunted, stumbling back. Shocked? Yeah. Didn't expect that, did you? The lean guy with the scar moved next. Faster. He had a knife. Ethan saw it coming before the guy even knew he was going to throw it. A quick dodge. Then, Max lunged. Straight for the knife hand. Teeth sank into flesh. The guy screamed, stumbling. Ethan didn't let him recover. One step forward. A punch to the throat. The guy collapsed. The cafe guy hesitated. Big mistake. Ethan was on him before he could react. A sharp elbow to the jaw. His head snapped back. Max snarled, ready to finish it. The guy didn't even try to fight. He ran. The SUV peeled out before Ethan could get a plate number. And just like that, it was over. The street was quiet again. Ethan stood in the middle of it, breathing steady. Max stayed tense, waiting. Ethan ran a hand over the dog's head. Yeah, buddy. We won. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Not until Brandon paid. Ethan didn't go home. He went looking. He found Brandon exactly where he expected, his father's mansion. The front gate was locked. Didn't matter. Ethan wasn't knocking. He climbed, slipped through the shadows, and when he reached the back patio, where Brandon sat drinking whiskey, he let Max bark. A loud, sharp warning. Brandon spun around, dropping his glass. The color drained from his face. You. Ethan stepped forward. Let's talk. Brandon backed up. Scared. For the first time? Really scared. Why you can't be here, Brandon stammered. My father, he'll... Your father's not here. Ethan kept moving. Slow. Deliberate. Brandon tried to run. Max growled. He stopped. Ethan let the silence stretch. Then he leaned in close. I let you walk away before, he said. I won't make that mistake again. Brandon's breath hitched. You broke into my home. Ethan's voice was low. Dangerous. You tried to take my dog. Brandon shook. You sent men to kill me. Ethan grabbed Brandon by the collar. You think money is going to save you? Brandon's breath was ragged. Ethan's grip tightened. Listen to me, you little shit, he growled. This is over. You ever come near me again? Near Max? His voice dropped to a whisper. I won't just scare you. Brandon nodded frantically. Okay. I swear, oh. Ethan held him for another second, then shoved him back. Brandon fell to the ground, gasping. Max stood beside Ethan, tail still, waiting. Ethan looked down at Brandon one last time. Remember this feeling, he said. Then he turned and walked away. Brandon didn't follow. He never would, because some fights aren't worth dying for. The sun was just beginning to rise when Ethan stepped back into his apartment. It had been a long night. Max trotted inside first, his golden fur still bristling, ears perked as he checked every corner of the room. Even after everything, he was still in soldier mode, waiting for the next fight, the next enemy. Ethan knew exactly how that felt. He shut the door behind him, locking it. And for the first time in weeks, he exhaled. It was over. Ethan didn't sleep. Not yet. Instead, he sat in his usual spot on the couch, running his fingers absently through Max's fur. The retriever sat beside him, head resting on Ethan's prosthetic leg, his body finally relaxed for the first time in days. Ethan had been ready for a real war. But in the end, Brandon had folded like wet paper. The moment Ethan had put his hands on him, the moment he saw the truth that Ethan was never going to break, he crumbled. Rich kids like Brandon didn't fight. They paid others to do it for them. And when that didn't work, they ran. Ethan had left him shaking on the patio floor, knowing full well he'd never see him again. Some men needed to be beaten to understand their place in the world. Brandon had learned his lesson. The hard way. Ethan's phone buzzed. A new text. From a new number. Unknown number. I get it. It's done. That was it. No name. No apology. Just a quiet surrender. Ethan smirked. He put the phone down and didn't bother replying. The next morning, Ethan walked Max down to the cafe. It was a new day, but the town felt different now. The usual customers were there, Sophia behind the counter, a few older men chatting at a table outside. But there was something missing. No loud revving of a Maserati engine. No entitled laughter from a group of bratty rich kids. No more Brandon. Ethan ordered his usual coffee. As he waited, Sophia leaned in. He's gone, she murmured. Ethan didn't ask how she knew. Small towns talk. Ran off to the city. Heard his dad shipped him off somewhere quiet. Probably some penthouse where no one knows what a coward he is. Ethan nodded. Good. Sophia studied him for a moment, then smiled. Then she looked down at Max. He deserves a steak after this. Max's ears perked up. Ethan chuckled. Damn right, he does. That night, Ethan sat on his small apartment balcony, watching the sky darken. Max lay beside him, stretched out, finally at peace. The fight was over. But some fights? They stay with you. Ethan ran a hand down his metallic fingers, feeling the smooth, lifeless surface. The war had taken parts of him, but not all of him. He looked at Max. This dog, his partner, his protector, had saved him. Not just in the war. Not just against Brandon. But every day, in ways that couldn't be explained. Ethan reached down, scratching behind Max's ear. Looks like we won, buddy. Max let out a deep sigh, his tail thumping against the floor. Yeah, they won. And for once, Ethan let himself believe it was over. Some wars are fought on battlefields. Some in quiet towns. But in the end, the ones who survive are the ones who never back down.